Hey people, in this video I'm making a YouTube subscription counter in the style of one of those YouTube creators rewards, but instead of shiny gold or silver, it's going to be made with plywood. The YouTube Small Makers Facebook group, the Small Workshop YouTube Makers Facebook group, that's right, have a challenge this March to see if we can create something inspired by the YouTube red play button. Now, I thought this was a great opportunity to do something that I'd wanted to do immediately after creating my channel, a counter for my subscribers. Now, the idea of making it into a style of award was fairly obvious. I quickly found it had been done many times before, but I don't care. This gave me an opportunity to create a wooden button and something far more motivational than just a counter on its own. And the first step was to get an exact sizes for the frame and the button, so I gave a friend of mine a quick call.
Hello!
Hey bud, it is I, TheWoodgineer.
Oh, hello! How are you doing?
Yeah, fantastic, thanks matey. Actually, I'm working on a project at the moment that I think I might need your help.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it's a replica of the YouTube Creators Award, you know, the one they send out, but with ply.
Are you going to make it out of plywood?
Well, you don't think I deserve one of those shiny metal ones, do you?
Alright, yeah.
Anyways, it's going to have a YouTube subscription counter built in, using an ESP8226.
Who taught you how to code?
Well, partly you,
Oh.
and partly just winging it like I usually do.
Alright, yeah.
Anyways, you've got a silver one, right?
Yeah, I have got one of those.
Great. Any chance I could get the dimensions from you?
Yeah, I can do that. Here it is. Yeah, I'll just quickly measure it. Yeah, it's about 205mm wide and 255 long and about 35 deep. Yeah, and the badge thing's about 100mm by 70 and slightly crooked.
Okay. This is just the silver one, right?
Yeah, silver. Yeah, you don't get gold till you get to 1,000,000.
Don't worry. You're over halfway there, mate.
So, yeah. Yeah, it's shiny.
You're stroking it, aren't you?
All right, well, good luck with that.
I'll send you some pics later, mate.
I'll give you a shout out when you've done it.
Cheers, mate. I might have to give you a shout later if I get stuck with the code.
Yeah, we can help you with coding.
Thanks, bud. Hopefully I can do this one solo.
All right, then. Cheers, Chris. Bye.
Cheers, matey. See you later. Okay, so I've got the basic dimensions, and I already have an IKEA frame that's about the same size, so I'll use that. I need to get a printed certificate roughly in the style of the Creators Award. I used Inkscape to do this, as it's easy and free. I'll leave a link to where you can get this in the video description. First, I marked out the frame to both see how much space I'll have, but also to give me an idea of what it will look like. I then wrote out the text in Arial Narrow, which is the closest match I could find to the font. I put the YouTube logo on there as well, and created a space where my counter could sit behind. I then used a small rectangle the size of the counter to help with the placement, as this could sit at the rear of the frame behind the counter. I've included a download of the file in case anyone wants to use it for their own. Perfect, now let's come up with some stuff to stick in this frame. The next big step is the electronics for the counter, as without that it's just a big wooden trinket in a frame. I used an ESP8266 Wemos D1 Mini, which is effectively a programmable microcontroller with Wi-Fi and at around £5. It can be used as an Arduino as well, so I'm already familiar with configuring and coding on one. Now, I had to set up the headers with both the ESP8266 and the display, but despite my terrible soldering, this was easy enough to do. Now, I did originally try using a 4-digit 7-segment display on its own, but I found this really fiddly to get the code working, so I ended up using a TM1637 LED display module. Now, as it has its own driver, it was a breeze to connect the microcontroller and use with just a few jumper leads. I felt USB connection via the ESP8266 was fine for power, but if I wanted to, I could have added a battery or just a mains supply. So that's it, all the electronics is done. So the display on its own doesn't really do much, and it needs some code for it to do its magic. Now I use the Arduino development editor, which is free to download, to create and upload my code. You need a library to use the LED display module, and also to run the ESP8266, and these are both available via the library manager. You will also need to add the ESP8266 to the selectable boards using the board manager. Now I may do a proper tutorial at some point on how to get that set up with the ESP8266, but there's so many out there, you could find that easy. Next I used a method of coding I call smushing, which takes two well-written pieces of code and smashes them together to create a mutant hybrid that just about does what you want it to do. Now I've been reliably informed that this isn't a concept unique to hobbyist coders, and professionals do this all the time. Now the mutant hybrid code gets a little bit of love with some basic debugging, removing any redundant lines, but for the most part it just looks a mess, but at the end of the day it works. Now, with some working electronics and a frame, I needed to get a button made, and of course it had to be wood. Now part of me wanted to create this beautifully sculpted piece of hardwood, but instead I opted for one of my favourite engineering materials, plywood. I felt I had to orientate it to show off the edge grain as much as possible, which meant doing a glue up of several layers that could shape afterwards, otherwise of course you wouldn't see the edge of the wood. So I found some reasonable quality plywood in my wood store and cut it down into small strips. I then cut down the strips of plywood into small sections that I could glue back together. I actually made enough of these bits of plywood to make a few blanks for the buttons, so I'd have some wood to practice with. I applied some strong wood glue to the blanks and clamped them together to dry overnight. And one of the pieces was a little too thick, so I used my bandsaw to cut down the size a little bit. Now, as I'd recently done some pine really smooth with my thickness planer, I thought I could smooth out the plywood as well. This didn't turn out too great though, and I had a bit of a chip out on the edges. So I thought sanding would be the way to go, so I broke out my belt sander. I thought this could end really badly if I don't clamp it down, so I used my metalworking vise at first, and then realised the metalworking vise wasn't heavy enough. This could tip over and then run away with the vise attached to it, and possibly run at me and attack me, so I'm having none of this. So I jammed it into my woodworking vise instead. Now the belt sander seemed finally safe and secure, and it removed material really quick, but it did leave some nasty sanding marks on the wood. So I used my random orbit sander to smooth the pieces of plywood, and found this much better as it left very little marks. So we've done our bits and pieces, looking pretty good. Piece that went through the planer, it's pretty rough, don't like it. Piece that went through the planer and then got orbital sanded down, it's pretty smooth. There's a little bit of tear out on the edges, don't know if you can see that. Not too worried because we're going to cut around this and it's waste anyway. And of course this is the bit that just went on the orbital sander. It's just as smooth. We went up through the grits, of course, from 60 to 120 to 240. It's pretty nice. Therefore I think, why waste the time with a planer? Let's just all sand it from now on with plywood. Yeah, I like that. So I had the rough dimensions of the button from James, of course, but if you go to the branding section of YouTube's website, you can get hold of the actual vectors and files for the proper button. So I did this and printed off the button onto a paper template. These templates were cut out and then glued to the plywood with spray adhesive. Do remember to shake thoroughly, it's important. I then used the bandsaw to cut them out to the button size. Then over to the spindle sander, where I shaped the edges of the buttons closer to the line and gave them a bit of a rounded edge. I then drilled holes for the scroll saw blade in the middle of the buttons and cut out the triangle from the middle using a Flying Dutchman No. 3 blade on the scroll saw. Now I originally wanted the button to be red, but I felt this might detract from the plywood edge grain, so instead I used a piece of bright red babinga wood for the triangle in the middle. So I cut down some of this babinga wood on the bandsaw and gave it a quick sand before tracing the template using the button's actual holes that I'd already cut out. And of course, I cut out the babinga on the scroll saw. I made sure the triangle was sanded a little so that it would jam fit into place, and then I glued it in securely with some sacrificial bits of wood being used to secure it from behind. Now, the finishing. The first coat was a tung oil stroke methylated spirit mix, which I've used before to make the wood pop a little and also to raise the grain. And once tacky dry, I used some high grit sandpaper to rub that grain back down by hand, ready for the next coat. I then added a coat of polyurethane varnish and gave it a very light sand. My thoughts were this polyurethane would really seal the button and give it a nice shine. And of course, finally, one second coat of polyurethane varnish, and I felt I was nearly there. Okay, I'm happy enough with how these have turned out. As you can see, fairly shiny. Little tiny bit pitted though, almost needed some filler. But of course, what can fill those little pits and at the same time not detract from the shininess and maybe even enhance the effect? So I'm thinking wax! Wax on, wax off. You know, let's go full Karate Kid on these things. That being said, I don't have any nice wax, so I do have some machine wax for various machine things. Let's try some of that. I applied the machine wax and then cleaned it off with a lint-free rag. You can probably see from my finishing choices I have no idea what I'm doing, but the end product looked nice, and that's what counts for something, because this thing's not going to be touched or exposed to direct sunlight or the elements, so if it looks nice, it's going to stay nice for a while, so I'm happy. So the electronics is done, the wooden button is done, it was time to get this thing into a frame and up on the wall. So first I opened the frame up and slid my printed certificate inside, as well as mounting the version of the certificate with the placeholder onto the back of the frame. I then drilled a small hole in the edge of the frame to allow for the USB power cable. I then hot glued the counter onto the placeholder rectangle and then the ESP8266 just next to it. As there would have been a lump where the LED display is, I glued a spring sort of in the gap at the top of the frame, which made sure the certificate remained pushed up against the glass. The frame was then closed up and secured into place with some offcuts of ply. Man, that looks terrible. But hey, the front looks nice, so it'll be fine. Lastly, the button was attached to the frame with some hot glue, and perfect! Let's mount this somewhere in the workshop and let the motivation commence! Please check out my fellow makers' videos to see what they have done with the YouTube red button. Now, I'll post links to their channels and videos in the description. Now, I really enjoyed working on this project as it combined electronics and woodworking, something I'd like to do more of. And I'd like to do more videos like this and really appreciate feedback, so please leave any comments below if you have any feedback or ideas. And if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, or if you didn't, give me a thumbs down. And please also subscribe so that we can really test this thing out. Thanks for watching, people, and have a great day.